The rain came down hard over Greenwich, Connecticut, the way it always did in October. Not in polite sheets, but in angry sideways curtains that turned the manicured lawns of the Whitfield estate into something dark and shapeless. The iron gates at the end of the long driveway were slick with it. The hedgerows dripped. The stone lions flanking the front entrance stared forward with the same cold indifference they had always shown, unmoved by weather, unmoved by anything. Mara Whitfield stood in the center of her father's study and watched the rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she told herself she would not cry. Not here, not in front of him. She was 18 years old today. The mahogany-paneled study smelled of cedar and expensive leather, and the faint, lingering ghost of cigar smoke that had seeped into the walls over decades of closed-door negotiations. Two heavy crystal tumblers sat on the antique desk catching the firelight. The bookshelves rose to the ceiling, filled with volumes that Mara suspected had never once been opened. Everything in this room was chosen to communicate the same thing: power, permanence, dominance over lesser men. Her father stood behind the desk. Garrison Whitfield was 52 years old, and he wore it the way he wore everything, with precision and deliberate control. His suit was charcoal brioni, his cufflinks platinum, his silver hair swept back without a strand out of place despite the weather outside. He had the kind of face that photographers loved: strong jaw, pale eyes, the weathered authority of a man who had spent 20 years making decisions that moved cargo and capital across hemispheres. To shareholders, he was visionary. To competitors, he was ruthless. To the employees of Whitfield Global Logistics, who passed him in the corridors of the Manhattan headquarters, he was simply a force of nature, something you did not argue with, something you stepped aside for. To Mara, he was her father. And right now, he was looking at her the way a man looks at a failed investment. She had her canvas duffel bag pressed against her chest like a shield. It was worn at the corners, faded olive green, the same bag she had carried on every camping trip, every field research weekend, every early morning she had spent collecting soil samples at the edge of the Connecticut wetlands for her environmental science thesis. It had been her companion through 4 years of early mornings and late nights. It did not belong in this room, neither did she. She understood that now. "You made your choice, Mara," Garrison said. His voice was flat and controlled, the voice he used in boardrooms when he had already decided the outcome and was merely walking everyone else toward it. "I gave you every advantage. I arranged the enrollment at Georgetown Law. I structured the partnership track with the Ashford Group. I gave you a clear path, a guaranteed future, and you walked away from it." She did not answer immediately. She had been over this particular argument enough times in her head to know that there was no version of it that ended well for her inside these walls. "I want to study environmental science," she said quietly. "I want to do something that matters." Garrison's expression did not change. That was the thing about him. His face was a controlled instrument, never betraying more than he intended. "Environmental science," he repeated, tasting the words like something unpleasant. "At a state college, with a full scholarship you applied for without telling me." He let that last detail hang in the air like a verdict. From the far side of the room near the stone fireplace, a soft sound broke the silence. It was not quite a laugh. Diane Croft Whitfield stood beside the fire with a glass of red wine held loosely in her fingers, the deep burgundy catching the light. She was 44 years old and wore that age like a deliberate choice, effortlessly composed, her dark hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, her charcoal silk blouse without a single crease. She had come into Mara's life when Mara was 4 years old, 18 months after Claire Weston Whitfield had died, in the hours following Mara's birth. Diane had arrived quietly, carefully, as if she had simply always been meant to be there. She looked at Mara now with an expression that was almost sympathetic. Almost. "Garrison, darling," she said, her voice low and smooth, "please don't upset yourself over this. You always knew it would come to this." She tilted her head slightly, studying Mara with pale eyes. "She's always been exactly like her mother, too curious for her own good." The words landed like a flat stone on still water. Mara had heard Diane make that comparison before, always in the same measured tone, always framed as concern rather than condemnation. As a child, she had taken it as a kind of compliment. Her mother had been brilliant, passionate, deeply principled. But standing here now, 18 years old, with her duffel bag clutched to her chest, Mara heard something else underneath the words. Something that had always been there, patient and buried, that she had simply not been old enough to recognize before. She pushed it aside. She would think about it later. Your mother, Garrison began. Do not. Mara's voice came out harder than she intended. Garrison stopped. For a half second, something moved behind his eyes. Then it was gone. He picked up the heavy brass letter opener from the desk and used it to slide a small manila envelope to the edge of the polished mahogany. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed, the edges soft with age, tied shut with a piece of faded twine. It slid off the desk and fell to the floor with a soft, pathetic slap near the toe of Mara's worn canvas sneakers. Your grandfather's cabin, Garrison said. The deed is in your name, effective today. That is your inheritance, Mara. 20 acres of wilderness in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. As of this moment, your trust fund is dissolved. Your credit cards have been deactivated. Your phone account has been transferred out of my plan. He straightened the letter opener on the desk, aligning it precisely with the edge of the blotter. You are no longer a Whitfield dependent. You are no longer my responsibility. I suggest you leave the property before I ask security to assist you. The room was very quiet. Mara bent down and picked up the envelope. Her fingers did not tremble. She was proud of that later, looking back, that in that specific moment in the room where she had been formally erased from her own family, her hands had been steady. Inside the envelope was a folded deed, 2 pages of legal language she did not read right then in a single key. It was iron-heavy for its size, mottled with decades of rust that had settled into the complex, asymmetrical teeth like dark lacework. It was not the key to a padlock or a storage unit or a post office box. It was too long, too intricately cut for anything that simple. She turned it over in her palm and felt the weight of it, and then she put it in the front pocket of her jeans and picked up her duffel bag. She did not say goodbye. She walked out of the study down the long marble corridor, lined with portraits of Whitfield men going back 4 generations, through the massive oak front doors and into the rain. The cold hit her like a wall. She crossed the stone driveway to her car, a 1998 Subaru Outback in a shade of green that might once have been called forest, but had long since faded to something closer to resignation. It had 187,000 miles on it and a heater that worked on its own schedule. It was registered in her name. Garrison had never touched it, never offered to replace it, and she had always suspected that was because he considered it beneath acknowledgement. Today, that indifference was the only gift he had ever given her that she was genuinely grateful for. She got in. She sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, listening to the rain pound the roof. She opened her banking app. $387, half a tank of gas. She put the car in drive and pulled through the iron gates without looking in the rearview mirror. She did not cry until she was on the highway alone, with the rain-blurred Connecticut landscape moving past her windows at 70 miles an hour. And even then, it was brief, 3 hard minutes of grief and rage and something that felt like falling. And then it was over, and she was just driving. She had 6 hours ahead of her and nowhere else to go. Samuel Whitfield had been many things over the course of his 81 years. He had been a merchant marine at 19, a naval logistics officer at 23, an engineer with a gift for solving movement problems. How to get the right cargo to the right place across the most efficient possible path that had earned him patents and eventually the seed capital to build Whitfield Global Logistics from a single leased warehouse in Newport News, Virginia, into one of the largest private shipping conglomerates in the eastern United States. He had also been, in Mara's experience, the only adult in her life who had ever treated her like a person worth talking to. While Garrison ran the company and Diane managed the estate and the social calendar and the careful architecture of their family image, Samuel had taken Mara on drives through the Blue Ridge Mountains, teaching her the names of trees. He had shown her how to navigate by the stars on clear summer nights, lying on his back in the field behind the cabin, with a star chart spread across his chest, one gnarled finger tracing constellations. He had taught her to read topographical maps, to test soil composition with her bare hands, to carve wood with a small folding knife he had carried since his merchant marine days. He had been endlessly, inexhaustibly curious about the natural world, which Mara had always found slightly incongruous in a man who had spent his career moving cargo across it. When she asked him about it once, he had smiled in the way he always smiled when she asked a question he considered worth answering, a slow, considered expression, eyes brightening at the corners. The world only sees the fresh paint, Mara, he had told her. They look at the surface and they think they understand the whole thing, but the canvas underneath, that's where the real structure is. That's where everything that holds it together lives. Nobody bothers to check the canvas. She had been 11 years old, sitting on the porch of the cabin with a half-finished wood carving in her lap. She had not entirely understood what he meant, but she had filed it away in the place where she kept the things he said, that particular mental shelf she had been building since she was old enough to recognize that he was worth listening to. He had walked away from Whitfield Logistics in 2013, abruptly without public explanation and over Garrison's furious objections. The industry press had run a handful of brief pieces about the founder's retirement. The family had told anyone who asked that Samuel was in poor health, that the demands of running a global conglomerate had become too much for a man of his age. Mara had visited him at the cabin the following summer, 14 years old, and freshly resentful of her father for reasons she could not yet fully articulate. Samuel had seemed entirely at peace. He had been building something in the cellar. He told her a project, a long-term project, something that would take years to finish properly. He would not say more than that, but his eyes had that brightness she recognized, that particular focus energy of a man working on something he believed in completely. She had thought it was a woodworking project. She had been wrong. In 2020, Samuel Whitfield died of a stroke at the cabin alone on a Tuesday morning in February. He was found by the county sheriff's deputy, who had been asked to perform a welfare check after his phone went unanswered for 3 days. His will, filed with a probate court in Fauquier County, Virginia, was simple and precise. The cabin and its surrounding 20 acres were to be held in trust until Mara's 18th birthday, at which point full title would transfer to her directly. Garrison had contested the will within weeks of the filing. The case had wound through the Virginia probate court system for 4 years. Garrison's legal team arguing that the land represented a corporate asset improperly transferred, that Samuel's mental competence in his final years was questionable, that the will itself bore irregularities. It had cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees on both sides, and it had gone nowhere because the will was ironclad and Samuel had known exactly what he was doing when he wrote it. And then 3 days ago, Garrison had abruptly withdrawn all pending motions. All of them, without explanation. His legal team had notified the probate court in a 2-paragraph filing that cited only a change in strategic priorities. No press statement, no explanation to Mara, no conversation about it at all until this evening, when a rusted key had been slid off a mahogany desk and dropped to the floor of a study where the rain streaked down floor-to-ceiling windows, and a woman in charcoal silk stood beside the fire and watched with pale eyes. Mara thought about that as the highway unspooled ahead of her. She thought about it through the mountain passes of northern Virginia, where the interstate gave way to state routes, and the state routes gave way to county roads that climbed and wound through forests so thick the headlights barely reached the tree line. She thought about it while the rain softened to a mist and the temperature dropped and the Subaru's heater kicked on and off on its own unpredictable schedule. 4 years of legal fighting. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent to keep her away from 20 acres of mountain land in a cabin worth less than the litigation costs. And then nothing. Withdrawal. Surrender. 3 days before her birthday. There was a logic to it if you were willing to follow it to where it led. She was. The mailbox at 1142 Ridgeback Hollow Road was a rusted cylinder on a leaning post, the reflective numerals barely legible in her headlights. The driveway beyond it was more suggestion than Road 2 tire-width channels of pressed gravel disappearing into the dark under a canopy of Virginia white pines, their roots muscling through the gravel from both sides. The Subaru lurched and pitched as she crawled along it, low branches scraping the roof like slow fingers. The cabin emerged from the darkness the way old structures do, gradually in pieces, the headlights finding it section by section as she came around the last bend. She stopped the car and sat for a long moment with the engine running. The roof was a ruin. The main ridge beam had sagged at the center under the accumulated weight of years of pine needle deposits and unchecked moisture pulling the surrounding structure down with it. The front porch had partially collapsed one corner, dropping to the ground, where the support post had rotted through at the base. English ivy had taken the east and south walls, completely a dense, suffocating green curtain that had crept under the eaves and was working its way toward the roof. The front window was intact on one side, cracked through on the other, and the door sat slightly ajar, in its frame shifted by years of the foundation settling beneath it. It looked in the October night like something that had been left behind a very long time ago. She got out of the car, pulled her jacket tighter against the mountain cold, and walked toward it. The key was in her pocket. She had been touching it periodically for the last 2 hours of the drive, without fully realizing she was doing it the way you touch a sore tooth, compulsively testing. She pushed the door open. Inside, the darkness smelled of mildew and cold earth and old paper. She turned on her phone's flashlight and swept it across the space. A small living area with a stone fireplace on the far wall. A kitchen counter along one side, the cabinet doors hanging open and empty. A wooden floor badly warped that protested under her weight at every step. Bookshelves along one wall still holding a scattering of old paperbacks in a row of technical manuals. A canvas sofa with a moth-eaten wool blanket folded over one arm. An oil lamp on the kitchen counter half full. It was a wreck. She sat down on the sofa, pulled the wool blanket around her shoulders, and went to sleep before she had time to think too carefully about what she was going to do next. She was not used to sleeping through the cold, but exhaustion has its own authority. She woke when pale gray light came through the cracked window, her neck stiff and her fingers numb, and for a single unguarded moment she did not know where she was. Then she remembered everything in the particular order that grief and reality arrive, when sleep releases you slowly at first, then all at once. She spent the first hours of the morning doing the kind of work that has its own straightforward mercy. She dragged ruined furniture out through the front door. She tore down cobwebs, swept grit and pine needles off the warped floorboards, emptied the kitchen cabinets of the few things that had survived some canned goods, a box of matches, a hand-operated can opener, a small folding knife, still sharp enough to be useful. She had crackers in her duffel bag and half a bottle of water, and she ate standing up at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the tree line. She had $387. The crackers would last 2 days. After that, she needed a plan. She was calculating options. Sell the land lease, it'd find out what environmental research grants were available for mountain watershed protection, whether there was anything in the timber rights that might generate immediate revenue. When she heard the crunch of boots on gravel outside, she moved fast. The iron fire poker from the hearth was in her right hand before the footsteps had crossed the driveway. She positioned herself beside the front window and looked out through the grime-layered glass. A man in his early 60s stood next to her Subaru, looking at the Connecticut license plates with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had learned to be cautious in the way that people who live alone in the mountains learn to be cautious. He was broad-shouldered with a weathered face and dark hair going silver at the temples, wearing a flannel work shirt and canvas jacket that had seen serious outdoor use. His hands were calloused and large. He did not look threatening. He looked like a man who had walked 3 miles of mountain ridge because he had seen something that did not belong in his landscape and had come to understand it. Mara kept the fire poker behind her leg and opened the front door. "Can I help you?" He turned startled. The kind of startled that a man with nothing to hide looks when surprised, just a quick, genuine flinch, not the controlled reaction of someone managing information. "Whoa, sorry about that. Didn't mean to spook you." He took a half step back, showing his hands briefly. "Name's Everett Bridges. I've got a property about 3 miles east over the ridge. Been watching over the Whitfield place since Samuel passed. Nobody's been up here in 4 years. Saw the tire tracks in the mud this morning and came to take a look. I'm Mara, she said. Samuel Whitfield was my grandfather. The property transferred to me today. Everett Bridges studied her for a moment, not sizing her up the way a suspicious man does, but with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing. Something in his expression settled. You've got his eyes, he said. Same color, same something behind them. The way he looked when he was working something out. He paused. Does your daddy know you're here? He's the one who gave me the key. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he turned and looked at the cabin as if seeing it fresh, and something shifted in the set of his jaw. Then I need to tell you something, he said. Something you should probably sit down for. They stood on the ruins of the front porch. Sitting was not advisable, the boards too uncertain, while Everett Bridges talked, and Mara listened with the fire poker still in her hand. A week ago, he told her, 7 days before her birthday. A convoy of 3 vehicles had come up Ridgeback Hollow Road, 2 heavy-duty work trucks from a contractor out of Richmond, and a black SUV with Virginia plates that Everett had not been able to read from his ridgeline. 6 men total. They had spent 4 hours walking the property perimeter, marking the tree line, and photographing the exterior of the cabin from multiple angles. One of them had tried the front door. It had not yielded. The door frame, Everett noted, was reinforced in a way that was not immediately obvious from the outside solid, where it should have been soft. The man had tried it twice and then given up. They had taken photographs of the foundation on all 4 sides. Before they left, one of the men in work clothes had driven a small orange stake into the ground near the driveway. Everett had walked down after they left and read the documentation attached to the stake. Structural assessment and scheduled demolition. Whitfield Global Logistics Property Management Division. Contractor, Blue Ridge Clearance Group, Richmond, Virginia. Scheduled date, Tuesday, October 15th, 4 days from now. I tried to look up the permit, Everett said. County Records Office said there was an application, but it was still pending review, which means they don't technically have authorization yet. He looked at Mara steadily. But I've seen this kind of operation before. They come back on Tuesday with the excavator, and they take the place down in 4 hours. By the time anyone files an objection with the county, there's nothing left to object about. Mara was quiet for a moment. She was doing the arithmetic. Garrison had fought to keep her from this property for 4 years. He had spent more money on the legal battle than the land could possibly be worth at fair market value. Then he had abruptly surrendered and dispatched a demolition crew before the property even officially changed hands. The crew had arrived a week before her birthday. They had tried to get inside the cabin and failed, and now the demolition was scheduled for Tuesday. He had given her the deed and sent her here because he expected her to arrive, find a rotting cabin worth nothing, and either sell the land immediately to him at whatever price he offered or simply walk away. Either way, whatever was inside the cabin would be rubble by Tuesday afternoon. He had not expected her to get here first. He had certainly not expected her to stay. Thank you, Everett, she said. He nodded once, reading her expression, with the careful attention of a man who had learned to let other people work things through at their own pace. I'll be around, he said. 3 miles east, like I said. You run into trouble, my number's on a card I'll leave under your windshield wiper. He looked at the cabin one more time, and there was something in his eyes that was almost protective. Samuel was a good man, best neighbor I ever had. Whatever he built up here, he built it for a reason. You do well to look carefully before you let anyone knock it down. He walked back down the driveway without looking back. Mara stood on the porch for a long moment after the sound of his boots on gravel faded. Then she went inside and started looking. She went through the cabin with the systematic attention she applied to fieldwork, methodical, patient, working from the outside walls inward. The bookshelves first, she pulled every volume and ran her hands along the back wall behind them. Nothing. The kitchen cabinets, the floor beneath the kitchen counter, the baseboards along the east wall. The bedroom stripped bare years ago where she checked the floorboards individually by pressing each one with her heel. The bathroom where the pipes had long since frozen and cracked, but the tile work was intact. 2 hours of careful search, and she had found nothing. She was standing in the center of the living room with sawdust in her hair and her hands dark with grime looking at the stone fireplace when Samuel's voice came back to her. Not as a memory with images attached, just the words in his particular cadence, unhurried and precise. The world only sees the fresh paint. Nobody checks the canvas. She looked at the fireplace. It was a substantial structure, fieldstone mortared together with real craft rising to the ceiling, with a solid oak mantelpiece that Samuel had carved himself. She had watched him work on that carving once, maybe the summer she was 9 or 10, sitting on the porch floor, with his small folding knife moving in careful practice strokes. The carved panorama ran the full width of the mantelpiece, Virginia white pines, their needles rendered in precise detail. A black bear standing at the edge of the tree line caught mid-stride, 2 ravens on a branch, and on the far right end, partly obscured by shadow, a wolf standing alone, head slightly lowered, watching. Mara stepped closer. She had looked at this carving dozens of times over the years, had traced the pine needles with a small finger as a child asked Samuel why the bear was there, been told it was because bears were honest creatures who made no pretense about what they were. She had never until this moment noticed that the wolf's eye was wrong. Every other carved eye in the panorama was the same, a shallow almond-shaped depression, smooth at the center, precisely rendered. The wolf's right eye was a circle, deep, cleanly drilled, perfectly round, not carved, bored out with a drill bit, the edges smooth and deliberate. Mara's hand went to her pocket. The key was iron heavy with those complex asymmetrical teeth she had found too intricate for any standard lock. She raised it slowly and pressed the tip against the wolf's eye. It fit, not approximately, not roughly, it fit with the precise, absolute certainty of something made for exactly this purpose. She felt the key seat itself against the interior mechanism, and she turned it slowly to the right. The sound that came from inside the wall was not a click. It was a heavy, measured mechanical sequence, the movement of multiple steel rods, the rotation of a cam mechanism, the release of a counterbalanced weight somewhere deep in the stone. Dust sifted down from the mortar joints. The oil lamp on the kitchen counter flickered, and then the right half of the stone fireplace moved. Not violently, not dramatically, it swung inward on completely hidden steel hinges with a low grinding authority, the stone face separating from the wall with a breath of cold, stale air that carried the smell of concrete and metal and something electrical. The gap widened slowly, a foot, 2 feet, until Mara was looking at a dark, narrow staircase of poured concrete descending straight down into the earth beneath the cabin's foundation. She stood very still. The cold air coming up from below was steady and dry, the particular dry cold of a controlled environment, not the damp chill of a forgotten cellar. She could hear very faintly a low mechanical hum from somewhere below. She picked up the oil lamp. She still had the fire poker in her other hand. She tested the first concrete step with her weight, found it solid, and began to descend. The staircase went down 12 steps and opened into a space that had no business being under a ruined mountain cabin. The walls were reinforced concrete, poured thick and finished with the care of a structure designed to last decades. The ceiling was 7 feet clean and uncracked. Along the far wall, 3 industrial dehumidifiers hummed in a row, their indicator lights steady green, connected by heavy conduit to an independent electrical panel that was itself connected to a bank of deep-cycle solar batteries stacked in a steel rack in the corner. The air down here was cool and perfectly dry, the temperature precise in the way of a climate-controlled vault. In the center of the room, a state-of-the-art server rack stood blinking with faint green and blue status lights, connected by thick cables to the solar battery system. The servers were running. Whatever they were doing, they had apparently been doing it quietly for years down here, in the dark, waiting. But Mara did not look at the servers for long. Because against the far wall, stacked on 10 heavy wooden pallets, were rows of military-grade canvas bags in olive green, hundreds of them neatly organized, strapped in place with wide nylon webbing. One of the bags near the bottom had shifted, and its contents had spilled across the concrete floor in a loose, glittering cascade. Gold coins, heavy, solid, each one the size of a silver dollar, each one stamped with the face of a springbok. South African Krugerrands, pure gold, minted, hundreds of thousands of them. She stood there for a long time looking at a fortune that her grandfather had spent years assembling and hiding in the earth beneath a cabin that her father had tried to demolish before she could reach it. Then she turned. In the center of the room, bolted to the concrete floor, stood a heavy steel drafting table. Across its surface, organized with meticulous care, under plastic sleeves lay documents, photographs, blueprints, legal contracts with official letterheads, surveillance images printed on glossy paper shot from distances and angles that suggested long-range photography or intercepted satellite imagery. At the center of the drafting table, pinned to a steel corkboard mounted on the wall, was a photograph. 8 by 10, high resolution, printed with the clarity of a professional camera. It showed two men shaking hands at what appeared to be a private airfield. One man was wearing a dark suit and had his face turned slightly toward the camera. The other man was in military-style clothing, his features partially obscured, but his build and posture unmistakable to anyone who had spent time looking at photographs from international arms trafficking prosecutions. The man in the dark suit was Garrison Whitfield. Across the photograph in thick red marker, someone had drawn a jagged X. Beside the photograph, in a neatly organized stack, was a ledger. Hand-assembled, leather-bound, its pages dense with handwritten entries in the small, precise script that Mara had watched fill star charts and topographical maps in the margins of engineering manuals over the course of her childhood. The entries did not track legitimate cargo. They tracked weapon shipments. They tracked payoffs. They tracked the movement of contraband through the shadow architecture of a global logistics company that had been built by an honest man and taken apart from the inside. And on top of the ledger, placed with the deliberateness of something left rather than forgotten, was a journal. The cover was dark leather, worn smooth. Embossed on the front in careful gold leaf that had barely faded despite the years was a single line: for Mara. Use the gold to survive. Use the truth to burn his empire to the ground. She picked it up with both hands and held it. The hum of the dehumidifiers, the faint blink of the server lights, the cold, clean air. Samuel Whitfield had not retreated to these mountains because he had lost his mind. He had not walked away from his company because age had taken his clarity or grief had hollowed out his purpose. He had walked away because his son had turned everything he had built into a machine for something terrible, and he had chosen to fight it the only way available to him, quietly, methodically, over a decade alone in the mountains, building the kind of evidence that could not be dismissed or destroyed or buried. He had built this for her, not because he had known exactly what would happen or when or how, but because he had known her father, had known the kind of man Garrison Whitfield was willing to become. And he had known the stubbornness in her, the precision, the refusal to look away from things that demanded to be understood. He had spent 10 years preparing a weapon. He had left it to the one person he trusted to use it. Mara sat down on the cold concrete floor, her back against the leg of the steel drafting table, the leather journal in her lap. The iron key was still in her hand, the rust rough against her palm. She opened the journal to the first page. Samuel's handwriting, dated January 2012, and she began to read. She read through the night. The concrete floor was cold beneath her, and at some point she pulled one of the olive green canvas bags off the nearest pallet and folded it under her as a cushion, and she sat there in the clean, dry air of her grandfather's bunker with the leather journal open across her knees and the server lights blinking their quiet rhythm in the dark. And she read every word Samuel Whitfield had written across 412 handwritten pages. He had started the journal in January of 2012, 3 months before he resigned from Whitfield Global Logistics and 18 months before he told anyone why. The early entries were measured and clinical, the careful observations of an engineer documenting an anomaly not yet fully certain of what he was looking at, routing discrepancies in the Eastern European division. Container manifests that did not reconcile with customs filings. Payment authorizations routed through subsidiary accounts that had no legitimate operational purpose. The kind of irregularities that a less experienced man might attribute to accounting errors or departmental miscommunication, but that a man who had personally designed the logistics architecture of the company recognized immediately as deliberate. Samuel had not panicked. He had documented. He had spent 8 months quietly pulling thread after thread before he understood the shape of what he was unraveling. By September of 2012, he knew. By the time he resigned in March of 2013, he had already begun building the bunker. Mara read the entries from that period, slowly sitting with each one long enough to let the full weight of it settle. Her grandfather writing in the mountains at night, his handwriting as precise at 73 as it had been at 30, describing in measured technical language how the company he had built from a single leased warehouse in Newport News had been transformed layer by careful layer into a logistics network for the movement of military-grade hardware across 3 continents. Drone components shipped as automotive parts, weapons systems disassembled and distributed across multiple container loads, each piece documented as civilian machinery bound for agricultural or construction use. Payment routed through a chain of shell companies that terminated in the Cayman Islands beneath an entity registered as D. Croft Holdings. He had tried twice to bring it to Garrison directly. The first time was in October of 2013, 7 months after Samuel had left the company. He had driven to Greenwich with a folder of documentation and sat across from his son in the same mahogany study where Mara had stood 18 hours ago. Garrison had listened for 20 minutes and then told his father that the documents were irregularities he was already aware of, and was in the process of correcting that the Eastern European operation was a complex regulatory environment that required flexible accounting approaches, and that Samuel's insistence on treating modern global logistics with the moral simplicity of a 1970s merchant marine was the kind of thinking that had made his retirement timely and necessary. Samuel had gone home and kept building. The second time was 2015. He had gone not to Garrison, but to a family attorney, a man named Theodore Marsh, who had handled the Whitfield estate work for 30 years, and asked Marsh to formally transmit a summary of the documented evidence to Garrison, with a legal notice that Samuel intended to file with federal authorities if corrective action was not taken within 90 days. Garrison's legal team had responded within a week with a letter that questioned Samuel's mental competence, referenced 2 occasions on which Samuel had allegedly exhibited confused behavior at family events, and suggested that any filing with federal authorities by an individual of questionable capacity would be viewed as actionable defamation. They had tried to get ahead of him, tried to establish on paper that he was not credible. Samuel had written about that evening in a single paragraph, and it was the only place in 400 pages where Mara felt his composure slip. The handwriting changed slightly, not dramatically, just a degree of pressure on the page, the letters slightly larger, as if the hand were compensating for something the mind was working to contain. "They called me a paranoid old man," he wrote. "My own son looked me in the face and told me I had lost my mind. I drove back to the cabin and I sat on the porch and I thought about Claire and about what she would have said, and then I went inside and I kept working." Mara sat with that paragraph for a long time. Claire Weston Whitfield, a woman Mara had only ever known through photographs, through the few stories Samuel told carefully and with great deliberateness, as if he were handling something fragile. Her mother had died on a Tuesday morning in February, 8 hours after Mara was born. A hemorrhage sudden and catastrophic in a hospital room where everything had moments before seemed fine. Garrison had been there. Samuel had been in the waiting room down the hall, and by the time they told him, it was already over. Mara had always understood without anyone explicitly telling her that Claire's death had broken something in Garrison that had never fully reset, that the man her father had been before that Tuesday morning and the man he became after it were not quite the same person, that the distance she had always felt from him was the distance of a man who had learned to keep people far enough away that losing them again could not do the same damage twice. What she had not understood until now was that Diane Croft had arrived in the precise aftermath of that breaking. Samuel had noted the date of Diane's first appearance in the family's life with the same careful precision he applied to everything. November 14th, 2007, 14 months after Claire's death. A charity gala in New York where Garrison had been persuaded by a board member to appear for the first time in more than a year. Samuel had been there. He had watched Diane Croft approach his son with the unhurried confidence of a woman who knew exactly where she was going and had planned the route in advance. He had written about it that night, "Something is wrong with this woman. I cannot tell you what it is or how I know it, but I know it." He had spent the following 5 years trying to prove it to himself, and the 5 years after that proving it to anyone who would eventually listen. D. Croft Holdings had been incorporated in the Cayman Islands in 2004, 2 years before Diane had walked into Garrison's life. The company had been a dormant shell, one of dozens in a layered ownership structure, until 2008, the year after Diane and Garrison began their relationship. From that point, it had become the primary beneficial owner of the operational accounts that funded the contraband network moving through Whitfield Logistics. Diane had not infiltrated the company after marrying Garrison. She had built the infrastructure before she ever met him, and then she had married him. She had waited. She had planned. She had looked at a grieving man with a global logistics network and no one strong enough beside him to protect what he had, and she had decided that she was the right person to take it. Samuel had understood all of this by 2014. He had spent the remaining 6 years of his life building the evidence into something so comprehensive, so meticulously sourced and cross-referenced that no attorney, no federal agency, no congressional oversight committee could dismiss it as the work of a confused old man. The last entry in the journal was dated November 3rd, 2019, 3 months before Samuel died. It read, "The system is complete. The files are locked. The key is cut. I have spoken with Thomas Hargrove at the county probate office, and the deed transfer is properly structured. She will come. I know she will come. Whatever her father does or does not do, whatever that woman convinces him of, Mara will come to this cabin because she is the one person in this family who has never stopped being curious about what is underneath the surface of things. She will find the canvas. I am certain of it. I am sorry I will not be there to see it. I am not sorry for any of the rest of it." Mara closed the journal. She sat in the silence of the bunker for a long time, her hand flat on the leather cover. Then she stood up, straightened her spine, and turned to face the computer terminal. The screen had gone dark while she read. She touched the keyboard, and the monitor came back to life, casting cool blue light across the concrete walls. The cursor blinked in a text field at the center of a stark black interface. Above the field in white sans serif type, a single prompt: "Identify the canvas." Mara pulled the chair out from the drafting table and sat down. She had 2 attempts remaining. The interface had displayed that warning in small red text beneath the prompt: 3 attempts total before the system initiated a full drive wipe protocol. She had used 1 attempt while she was reading an impulsive, badly considered try using her mother's date of death. The screen had flashed red immediately and the counter had dropped to 2. She would not make another impulsive attempt. She looked at the prompt: "Identify the canvas." She thought about everything Samuel had said about paint and canvas and what lay underneath the surface of things. She thought about the specific way he used the word not as a metaphor for concealment, but as a metaphor for foundation, the thing everything else is built on. Her mind moved through possibilities and discarded them one by one. Not a date, not a name, not a place. Samuel had taught her to read nautical charts the summer she was 8, spread across the kitchen table of this cabin, his finger tracing the depth soundings in the compass roses. He had talked that summer about the ship he had built his company on, not metaphorically, but literally. The first vessel he had owned outright, purchased with the capital from his first 3 logistics contracts refitted at a yard in Newport News, and launched in the spring of 1971. He had talked about that ship the way some men talk about their first home or their first great love, with a particular reverence that was not nostalgia, but something more structural, something foundational. He had called it the canvas I built everything on. She typed carefully without hurrying. 1971 Meridian. The cursor blinked once. The screen went entirely white, and then it opened. Folders cascaded across the desktop in ordered rows, each one labeled with the clinical precision of a man who had organized information for a lifetime. The Carthage files sat at the top of the hierarchy, a master directory containing 17 subfolders, each representing a different operational thread of the network Samuel had spent a decade mapping. Mara plugged the Kingston drive into the USB port. A progress dialog appeared. Estimated transfer time 14 minutes. She opened the master directory while the transfer ran. The first folder she clicked was labeled Antwerp Operations. What she found inside took her breath in a way that the gold on the pallets had not. Photographs high resolution, taken from elevated positions, clearly the product of careful long-range surveillance rather than any official investigation. Whitfield Global Logistics containers, stamped with the company's familiar blue and white lighthouse logo, being offloaded at a private dock facility outside Antwerp, Belgium. The containers were marked on their shipping manifests as agricultural equipment destined for a farm cooperative in western Ukraine. The photograph showed what was actually inside them: crates of drone components, carefully packed, each piece documented in Samuel's cross-reference notes as matching the specifications of a surveillance and targeting system that the State Department had placed on export restriction in 2016. The men receiving the cargo were not farmers. Samuel had included identification profiles on 3 of them, assembled from open-source intelligence and what appeared to be intercepted private communications. 2 were connected to a paramilitary organization operating across the eastern Ukraine border region. The third had appeared in a 2018 Interpol report on the illicit movement of military hardware through Eastern Europe. She opened a second folder, Project Chimera. This one was dense with technical documentation. Corporate communications, internal Whitfield logistics, memos, procurement orders. The memos detailed an operational protocol for shipping restricted, dual-use technology as civilian equipment, exploiting a regulatory gap in the Commerce Department's export control framework by distributing components across multiple manifests so that no single shipment triggered automatic review. The protocol had been in active use since 2009. It bore Garrison's authorization signature on the original approval memo. But the operational design, the specific methodology, the routing architecture, the shell company structure bore the fingerprints of someone who understood international financial infrastructure at a level that a shipping company CEO simply did not have. Someone who had built this kind of network before. A third folder, beneficial ownership. Here were the Cayman Islands incorporation documents. D. Croft Holdings, established 2004. The beneficial owner was listed as a Diane Elizabeth Croft with a registered address in Nassau, Bahamas. The entity had 14 subsidiary companies in its ownership chain, spread across 6 jurisdictions, each one a layer of insulation between the financial flows and the operational reality they funded. Samuel had traced every layer. The transfer bar was at 41%. Mara moved through the folders with focused speed, building a map in her mind of the full architecture. The network had been running for 15 years. It had moved hardware into at least 4 active conflict zones. The financial flows ran through the shell structure to accounts that funded private military contractors, at least 2 of which had appeared in congressional testimony related to destabilization operations in sub-Saharan Africa. And the entire structure depended on the logistics capability of a company whose founder had built it to move grain and manufactured goods and medical supplies, not weapons. Samuel had documented everything. Every layer, every name, every transaction he could trace. And in the final subfolder labeled simply Garrison, Mara found the thing that made her stop. It was a transcript. Audio recording converted to text dated October 2013, 1 week after Samuel's first attempt to confront his son. The recording had been made by Samuel in the cabin, apparently from a phone conversation. Garrison's voice was on it, and Diane's. She had not been in the room for the confrontation with Samuel. She had been as far as Samuel knew in New York. But the transcript showed that Garrison had called her immediately afterward, and that the conversation had lasted 47 minutes, and that in the course of those 47 minutes, Diane had walked Garrison through a very careful, very methodical construction of the narrative that his father was experiencing cognitive decline. She had done it gently, with apparent concern, with references to specific incidents that she characterized as evidence of confusion incidents that Samuel, in his annotation of the transcript, noted had either not occurred at all or had been distorted beyond recognition. She had suggested with great delicacy that it might be worth consulting with a physician. She had expressed love for Samuel. She had expressed worry. And Garrison had listened and agreed and repeated the narrative back to her as if it were his own conclusion. Mara sat very still with the transcript on the screen in front of her. 62%. She heard the sound from outside, not footsteps, something heavier. The low-engineered rumble of a high-displacement engine coming up Ridgeback Hollow Road, moving without the hesitation of an unfamiliar driver navigating an unmarked mountain road for the first time, moving with the speed and certainty of someone who had been here before or had been given coordinates. She was at the security monitor panel in 3 steps. The monitors were mounted above the server rack, 6 small screens connected to cameras that Samuel had hidden in birdhouses, hollow stumps, and the underside of a collapsed fence rail along the property perimeter. The images were grainy, but clear enough. A black Cadillac Escalade had stopped at the end of the driveway, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn dark. A second vehicle, a crew cab pickup with commercial plates, pulled in behind it. 4 men got out of the Escalade. They moved with the coordinated, economical precision of people who had done this kind of work before, not military exactly, but trained, purposeful. 2 of them carried tactical equipment bags. 1 moved immediately to flank the east side of the cabin. The 4th stood at the front of the vehicle and looked at the property with the assessing calm of someone running a calculation. Mara recognized him. She had seen Marcus Vane perhaps a dozen times over the course of her childhood, at corporate functions, at the annual Whitfield Logistics shareholder dinner, once at a 4th of July gathering at the Greenwich Estate, where he had stood slightly apart from the other guests and watched the crowd with the attentiveness of a man whose job it was to know things before other people knew them. He was VP of Risk Management officially. He wore good suits. He had an office on the 34th floor of the Whitfield headquarters in Manhattan. He was here at 4 in the morning on a Virginia mountain with a team of tactical contractors. 71%. She heard them on the porch, the deliberate testing of the reinforced door, the low exchange of voices. Then a harder impact. They had something with them, something heavy, a ram. Mara did not panic, she assessed. The bunker door would hold longer than the cabin door. It was steel core recessed into a concrete frame, and the release mechanism was internal only. But they would find it. Samuel had built it to be found eventually, not to be impenetrable. The escape route was what mattered. She pulled the Kingston Drive from the port at 79%. She pushed the thought of the remaining 21% aside and shoved the drive into her front jeans pocket alongside the iron key. She picked up Samuel's leather journal and put it in her duffel bag. Then she crossed to the pallets and unzipped 3 canvas bags and filled the duffel with Krugerrands until she estimated the weight at 40 pounds, the most she could move fast with. She zipped the bag and slung it across her shoulder. Above her, the impact sounds changed. They had breached the cabin door. Heavy footsteps on the warped floorboards directly overhead. Marcus Vane's voice, calm and carrying, tear it apart. He said the old man was paranoid. Look for false walls, floor panels, foundation voids. If the girl is here, you know the protocol. Mara stood in the center of the bunker with 40 pounds of gold on her shoulder and a drive containing 79% of her grandfather's life's work in her pocket, And she felt something that was not quite fear and not quite calm, but something between the two, a cold, functional clarity that her grandfather had apparently bet a decade of his life on her being capable of. She moved to the back of the room. Behind the server rack, partially obscured by thick bundles of cable management, was a circular steel hatch set flush into the concrete wall, 40 inches in diameter. A manual wheel lock at the center, the iron dark with oxidization. She grabbed the wheel with both hands and pulled counterclockwise. The resistance was considerable. Years of moisture migration and oxidization had welded the mechanism almost solid. She set her feet against the floor and put her full weight into it, the duffel bag swinging against her side, and the wheel held and then moved a quarter inch at first, just enough for her to know it would move. And then she reset her grip and pulled harder and felt the seal break with a deep grinding protest of metal on metal. Above her, the floorboards cracked and shifted under heavy weight. She heard the stone fireplace. One of the men, the brickwork is wrong. There are scrape marks on the floor like something swings out. She heard Marcus immediately find the release. Get the sledgehammer from the truck. She had less than 3 minutes. The hatch swung inward, releasing a breath of cold soil smell and the distant sound of running water. The escape passage was a corrugated steel pipe, 4 feet in diameter, sloping downward at roughly 15 degrees, disappearing into darkness. Samuel had built it to be functional, not comfortable. She went in feet first, pulling the duffel bag after her. The metal was cold against her palms, and she slid faster than she intended on the slope, the duffel bag scraping behind her until the grade leveled off and she was moving on her hands and knees through absolute dark, her phone in one hand, casting just enough light to see 3 feet ahead. The soil smell intensified. The pipe curved slightly, and then she felt cold air and saw a faint silvering ahead that resolved into a heavy steel grate set into the side of a creek bank. She hit the grate with her shoulder, and it swung outward on a spring hinge, and she tumbled out into the shallow edge of the creek, cold water immediately soaking through her sneakers, blackberry canes catching her jacket. She pulled the duffel bag through after her and lay flat for a count of 5, listening. Behind her and uphill, muffled by earth and distance, a concussive sound. The explosive entry charge on the bunker door. Then shouting more distant than she expected. She got up and ran. The creek masked her sound, and she followed it downstream, moving in the shallow margin where the water was only inches deep, stumbling on creek stones, but keeping her feet. The tree canopy closed above her, and the pre-dawn dark was almost total, but she could feel the water direction, and she used it moving downhill and away from the cabin, away from the vehicles on the driveway, into the cold heart of the Blue Ridge Forest. She did not stop until she could no longer hear anything behind her but trees. 48 hours later, Mara Whitfield was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth in the back of a truck stop diner outside Syracuse, New York, eating scrambled eggs she was paying for in quarters and planning the next phase of a war she had not started but had apparently inherited. She had driven the Subaru along back roads and secondary highways, staying off the interstates, stopping only for gas paid in cash from the emergency $20 bills she had kept folded in the inside lining of her duffel bag since she was 16 years old. A habit her grandfather had suggested with the casual practicality of a man who believed in being prepared for situations that had not yet announced themselves. She had pulled over once on the shoulder of a state route in rural Pennsylvania to check her phone before powering it off permanently. 15 missed calls from an unknown number, a cascade of news alerts. She had read one of them and then locked the screen and sat for a long moment looking at the dark tree line outside the window. Federal manhunt heiress Mara Whitfield sought in connection with Adirondack bombing and murder of Virginia resident Everett Bridges, considered armed and dangerous. Everett Bridges. She had driven the next 4 hours on something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but contained equal measures of both compressed into a cold, load-bearing thing behind her sternum that she used as fuel rather than weight. Diane had killed Everett, a man who had walked 3 miles over a mountain ridge because he saw something that did not belong in his landscape, who had stood on a rotten porch and told her what he knew, who had said Samuel was a good man, and I'll be around. Diane had killed him and used his death to build a wall between Mara and every legitimate institution that might otherwise have helped her. It was clean work in the way that truly ruthless planning is clean. Mara was 18 years old, freshly disowned, broke no lawyer, no family, no credibility. The FBI would have a press release, a booking photo, a narrative. She would be a fugitive first and a witness second if she was ever a witness at all, which meant she could not go to the FBI. She could not go to local law enforcement who would hold her while they contacted the FBI. She could not go to an attorney because any attorney she contacted would be required to flag her as a wanted fugitive. She needed a different mechanism. She needed someone whose power was not institutional, not dependent on the goodwill of agencies that had already been given a narrative about her. Someone whose platform was large enough and whose credibility was hard enough that the Carthage files would go public before anyone could stop them. She spent 2 hours at a library terminal in a small town outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, using a guest login in an encrypted browser session researching investigative journalists. She went through 12 names before she stopped on Rhett Calloway, senior correspondent, the Sentinel, Washington, D.C., 47 years old. 3 Pulitzer citations, 2 of them for investigations into corporate malfeasance at the intersection of government contracting and private industry. Known in the journalism community for a specific and consistent practice, he had never in 22 years of investigative reporting revealed a confidential source. Not under legal pressure, not under subpoena, not under any circumstances. He had written about this practice in a long-form essay that Mara read twice in its entirety. He did not frame it as heroism. He framed it as contract. You come to me with the truth he had written, and I will do what I can with it, but I will not hand you back. She created an encrypted email account from the library terminal and wrote to his professional address. She kept it short. I have the Carthage files. Whitfield Global Logistics is a front operation. The documentation goes back 15 years. I can prove everything. Philadelphia 30th Street Station, day after tomorrow noon. I'll find you. She attached a single document from the Kingston Drive, 1 invoice from the Antwerp operation with the names and amounts, redacted enough to show the routing architecture, but not enough to give away the scope. She logged out, cleared the session, and left the library. His reply was waiting when she checked the encrypted account from the diner in Syracuse using the refurbished laptop she had bought with part of the cash from the Krugerrand exchange. I read what you sent. I know what it means. I'll be the one with a 1999 copy of Popular Mechanics and Bad Coffee. Bring everything. She closed the laptop and ate the rest of her scrambled eggs. Then she went back to the Subaru, pulled onto the highway, and drove toward Philadelphia with her grandfather's drive in her pocket and 40 pounds of gold in the bag on the back seat, thinking about a man who had spent a decade in the mountains building something for her, who had believed with complete certainty that she would come and that she would understand and that she would know what to do with the truth when she found it. She was going to prove him right. Rhett Calloway was exactly what his byline photograph suggested. A man who wore his age with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who had been too busy for vanity. He was standing near the far end of the main hall at 30th Street Station with the promised copy of Popular Mechanics under one arm and a paper cup of coffee in his other hand, scanning the crowd with the particular attentiveness of a person who made their living reading rooms. His tweed jacket had seen several winters. His wire-rimmed glasses were slightly bent at the left temple, a detail Mara noted and found reassuring in a way she could not entirely articulate. She walked past him without stopping and dropped a folded napkin on the bench beside him. It read, Amtrak Quiet Car Train 94 Platform 6, 1 minute. She was already through the gate when she heard his footsteps behind her. The train pulled out of the station at 12:14. The quiet car was less than half full, the nearest other passengers 4 rows ahead and absorbed in their own screens. Rhett Calloway settled into the seat across from Mara, set his coffee on the fold-down tray, and looked at her with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned to let people arrive at the point at their own speed. You're Garrison Whitfield's daughter, he said, not accusatory, just placing her. His former daughter, Mara said, and slid the laptop across the table. Calloway opened it. She watched his face as he scrolled through the Carthage files. He was a controlled reader, the kind of person who processes information without performing a reaction to it. But the color left his face somewhere in the second folder, and by the fourth, it had not come back. He read for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he reached into the bag at his feet and produced a small external drive of his own. Compact, rubberized, the kind of equipment a person carries when they routinely handle sensitive information in the field. He connected it to his laptop, opened a cross-reference database, and began running the Cayman Islands routing numbers from the Carthage files against it. He stopped. He looked up at Mara. Your grandfather missed something, he said. His voice was careful, the way voices are when the information they are carrying is fragile. Tell me, the primary beneficial owner on these shell accounts, it isn't your father. Calloway turned the laptop so she could see the screen. The primary account holder is D. Croft Holdings. He looked at her steadily. Does the name Croft mean anything to you? The train moved through the Pennsylvania landscape, the autumn fields running past the windows in shades of brown and gold. Croft is my stepmother's maiden name, Mara said. Rhett Calloway nodded slowly. Your father is a signatory on these accounts. He has authorization to move funds and approve transactions. But the beneficial ownership, the entity that actually controls the underlying assets, is Diane Croft. Your father didn't build this network, Mara. He's been operating inside it for 17 years without understanding what it actually is. He paused. He's been used. Mara thought about the transcript. Garrison calling Diane immediately after the confrontation with Samuel. Diane's careful, methodical construction of a narrative. The gentleness of it. The completeness of it. Samuel knew, Mara said. He documented it. He tried to tell my father in 2013 and again in 2015. My father didn't believe him. Something moved across Calloway's face. Your grandfather tried to protect his son, he said quietly. And Diane made sure my father would never listen. Mara looked out the window. She's been doing this for 17 years. She built the infrastructure before she ever met him. She waited for the right moment after my mother died, and then she moved in. She's been running a global arms trafficking operation through my family's company, and my father has been signing documents and attending shareholder meetings and giving press interviews without knowing what any of it actually is. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his burner phone and looked at the screen and went very still. He turned the phone so Mara could see the notification. The CNN breaking news alert filled the screen. The text was brief and unambiguous and left no room for interpretation. She was wanted, nationally, for murder and domestic terrorism. Diane had not waited. She had moved the moment the bunker was breached, and Mara had slipped through, transforming a failed containment into a different kind of trap. The federal warrant was the new cage. And unlike a bunker door, you could not get through a federal warrant with a fire poker and a steel hatch. Calloway locked his phone and looked at her. We need to get off this train at the next stop, he said, right now, before anyone on board runs a passenger check. Mara looked at him. Can you publish it? She asked. The full Carthage files. Everything on the drive. Can you get it out? Rhett Calloway looked at her for a long moment at the duffel bag at her feet, at the iron key still visible in her front pocket, at the particular expression of a young woman who had been handed an impossible situation by a family that should have protected her and had chosen instead to use her as collateral. Yes, he said, but not from this train and not tonight. He stood picking up his bag. I have a place in North Philadelphia. Off-grid, not in my name, not connected to the paper. We go there, we set up the satellite uplink, and we push the files to every major outlet simultaneously. Once it's out, you have protection. Until it's out, you have nothing. Mara picked up the duffel bag. 40 pounds of her grandfather's own, 79% of his life's work. The iron key in her pocket and the leather journal in her bag, and a federal warrant with her name on it, and the full weight of what Samuel Whitfield had spent a decade building, resting on the choices she made in the next 12 hours. She stood up. "Then let's go," she said. The abandoned textile factory on Clearfield Street in North Philadelphia had not produced anything in 11 years. The building was 4 stories of dark brick, its windows boarded at the ground level, and broken above its loading dock doors, sealed with rusted chain and padlocks that had not been touched in a decade. From the street, it looked like every other shuttered industrial building in that part of the city, a monument to a particular kind of American, forgetting the kind that happens when manufacturing leaves a neighborhood and nothing comes to replace it. Red Calloway had a key to a side entrance on the alley face of the building. He did not explain how he had come to have it, and Mara did not ask. Inside, the ground floor smelled of concrete dust and old machine oil. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space as Calloway led her past the rusted hulks of textile equipment, long flatbed looms, steel frames, spooling apparatus toward a freight elevator in the back corner that he operated with a physical switch rather than a digital panel. The elevator was slow and loud, and they rode it to the 3rd floor in silence, listening to the cables work. The 3rd floor had been partially converted, at some point drop ceilings installed over part of the space, electrical conduit running along the exposed brick walls, a cluster of folding tables and mismatched chairs in one corner and near a window that had been carefully, deliberately left with its boarding slightly loose, admitting a narrow vertical strip of city light. On one of the tables sat a heavy-duty field laptop and a compact satellite communication unit in a military-grade case. A portable generator in the far corner already connected to a power strip running to the tables. Calloway had been here before. He had been here recently. He opened the satellite case with practiced efficiency and began running connection checks while Mara set the duffel bag on the floor and pulled out the Kingston drive. The generator started with a low, steady pulse. The satellite unit initialized with a sequence of indicator lights moving from red through amber to green. 10 minutes to establish a stable uplink, Calloway said, not looking up from the field laptop. Once we have it, I'll push the files to a pre-configured distribution list. 412 addresses, wire services, newspaper editorial desks, television network, investigative units, international outlets, free independent journalism platforms with their own server redundancy. The moment I hit send, it goes everywhere simultaneously. No single point of failure, no single outlet that can be pressured to sit on it. And if someone intercepts the uplink before it completes, the distribution is structured in packets. Each packet is independently encrypted and addressed, even if the transmission is interrupted at 90% and the 90% that's already out cannot be recalled. He looked up briefly. Your grandfather's system for the server files was similar in concept. He understood network redundancy. He understood how things get buried, Mara said. He built something that couldn't be. Calloway nodded once and went back to the keyboard. Mara put the Kingston drive on the table beside the laptop and walked to the loose-boarded window, looking out through the narrow vertical gap at the wet Philadelphia street below. Rain had followed them from the train arriving in the city an hour after they did, and now it moved through the amber glow of the streetlights in thin diagonal lines. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, a delivery truck at the far end of the block, a traffic light cycling through its sequence for nobody. She thought about Everett Bridges. She had been thinking about him in the spaces between necessary thoughts since she had read his name on the CNN alert, returning to it the way you return to a bruise, testing the edges of it. He had walked 3 miles over a mountain ridge because he saw something that did not belong. He had stood on a rotting porch and told her the truth about what was coming. He had said he would be around. He had been killed within hours of leaving her. Diane had moved that fast, had understood immediately that Everett was a complication, a witness who had seen the demolition team, who knew the timeline, who could corroborate Mara's account of what she had found. She had eliminated the complication and converted it into a weapon in a single operation. And she had done it within hours, which meant she had been watching the cabin from the moment Mara had pulled onto Ridgeback Hollow Road. She had been watching the whole time, waiting to see what Mara would find and how quickly and what she would do with it. Mara turned away from the window. How long have you known about Whitfield Logistics? She asked. Calloway did not stop typing. Rumors? 2 years, maybe 3. Nothing sourceable. The kind of thing that comes up in background conversations when you're reporting on adjacent stories. Defense, procurement, irregularities, export control, enforcement gaps. Whitfield's name appeared in the margins twice. Nothing I could take to an editor. He paused. I knew something was there. I couldn't get to it. Samuel got to it. Samuel built the entire case from the inside over a decade with no institutional support and no protection. Calloway said it flatly without embellishment, which somehow made it land harder than if he had tried to make it resonate. That is an extraordinary thing. Most people in his position, discovering what he discovered at his age and his family context, would have found a way to not know what they knew. The psychological pressure of that kind of knowledge over that kind of time without being able to talk to anyone about it. He stopped. He must have been a remarkable man. He was, Mara said. He was the best person I knew. The satellite unit chimed softly. Calloway looked at the indicator panel. We have a stable uplink, he said. I'm going to begin the file transfer from the drive to the distribution package. Once the packaging is complete, I'll need your confirmation before I push send. This is your call, Mara. Yours and Samuel's. I want to be clear about that. Mara crossed to the table and stood beside him. Start the transfer, she said. Calloway inserted the Kingston drive, navigated the directory structure with the speed of someone who had been told what to expect, and initiated the packaging protocol. A progress dialog appeared on the screen. A timer began counting. 9 minutes 40 seconds. Mara stood and watched the bar begin its slow advance. She was at 43% when she heard the sound. It came from below, not the street entrance, not the alley door, but from somewhere inside the building. The freight elevator moving. The distinct mechanical complaint of the cables working the low gear grind of a mechanism that had been operated too many times tonight for a building that was supposed to be empty. Calloway heard it too. He did not reach for his phone or his bag. He reached inside his jacket and produced a compact revolver that he set on the table to his right, within easy reach but not in his hand. A man who had made a calculation and landed on ready rather than reactive. Mara did not have a weapon. She looked around the floor space quickly. The folding tables, the old textile equipment someone had stored up here against the wall, a length of heavy steel conduit leaning against the brick. She took the conduit in her right hand. It was 4 feet long and solid. The elevator reached the 3rd floor and stopped. The gate opened. Marcus Vane stepped out of the elevator with the unhurried authority of a man who had already decided how the evening was going to end. He was wearing dark tactical clothing rather than the suit Mara associated with him from the shareholder dinners, and the difference was informative. He was not here in his official capacity. He was here as what he actually was, stripped of the corporate framing that made him presentable in boardrooms. 3 men came out of the elevator behind him. They spread into the floor space with practiced efficiency, 2 moving to flank the far sides of the room, 1 positioning himself between Mara and the freight elevator. Their movements were coordinated without verbal instruction, which told Mara they had done this particular kind of work together before. Each of them carried a suppressed tactical pistol. Marcus Vane's weapon was already drawn. He pointed it at Rhett Calloway's chest with the steady hand of someone who did not find pointing weapons at people stressful. Step away from the console, Mr. Calloway, he said. His voice in this context was exactly what it had always been at corporate functions, controlled precise, without unnecessary temperature. And close the laptop. Calloway did not move. His hand was 6 inches from the revolver on the table. You pull that, Marcus said without looking at the revolver, and we'll have a very different kind of conversation. Calloway moved his hand away from the revolver slowly. He did not close the laptop. Mara stepped forward. She moved deliberately, not quickly, stepping out from beside the table and positioning herself in the open floor space between Marcus and Calloway, the steel conduit in her right hand. 3 of his men had weapons. She had 4 feet of steel pipe. The mathematics were not in her favor, and she was not operating under the illusion that they were. She was operating under a different calculation entirely. Marcus, she said. He looked at her, the same assessing calm he had applied to the property perimeter in the pre-dawn dark of the Blue Ridge Mountains, looking at her the way he looked at everything as a variable to be accounted for. You need to check your account, she said, a small pause, barely perceptible. Excuse me, your retirement account, the Swiss private bank account that Diane has been funding for the last 9 years as your loyalty fee. Mara kept her voice level and her eyes on his. Check it. Right now. Pull out your phone and check it. Something moved in Marcus Vane's expression. Not much, barely the shift of a muscle near the jaw, but enough. She had landed on something real. She watched him make the calculation, the risk of showing a reaction versus the risk of not knowing, and watched him decide. He reached into his jacket with his free hand and produced a satellite phone. He kept the tactical pistol aimed at Calloway while he unlocked the phone with his thumb and navigated to whatever application connected him to that account. The room was very quiet. The progress bar on the laptop behind Mara was at 61%. She could see it in her peripheral vision, the faint glow of the screen. Marcus Vane looked at his phone. The change in his face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic, a kind of controlled, absolute stillness that was more frightening than an outward reaction would have been. The stillness of a man absorbing information that rearranges something fundamental, who has trained himself not to show the rearrangement. The account is empty, Mara said. $14 million liquidated and routed out within the last 6 hours. While you were driving up from Virginia, while you were tracking us to Philadelphia, Diane Croft was moving the money. She paused. Try her number. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he dialed. The automated carrier message was audible from where Mara stood. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. The silence in the room had a different quality now. She burned you, Mara said. The moment that bunker was breached and I got out with the drive, Diane knew the Carthage files were loose. She knew the architecture was exposed. So she did what she does. She started cutting. She cut the operational accounts. She cut the shell structure. She cut every person who could be traced back to her. Mara took one step closer to him. You've been doing her work for 9 years, Marcus. You've been the instrument that made her network function. And the moment the instrument became a liability, she liquidated it the same way she liquidates everything else. You're not her fixer anymore. You're a loose end. Marcus Vane stood very still. The Carthage files are uploading right now, Mara continued. In about 4 minutes, every wire service on the planet is going to receive 15 years of documented evidence about what has been moving through Whitfield Logistics and who has been running it. When that happens, every agency that has been looking at the network, the FBI, Treasury, Interpol, the DOJ is going to have names, Diane's name, the shell company structure, the routing numbers, all of it. She held his gaze. Your name is in those files too, Marcus. Samuel documented the operational payments to a security consulting entity that your name is attached to. But there's a difference between being a named contractor in a financial document and being the man who walked into this building tonight with a weapon and a team. She let that sit for a moment. One of those things is a wire transfer. The other is a federal felony being committed in real time. The two men flanking the far walls had stopped moving. They were looking at Marcus. Marcus Vane looked at the phone in his hand, at the screen that showed him a zero where $14 million had been this morning, at the number that no longer existed. He looked at the laptop screen behind Mara. 78%. He holstered his weapon. It was not a surrender exactly, it was a recalculation. The decision of a man who had spent his career making precise assessments of risk and benefit, who had just watched the benefit side of his particular equation go to zero. He looked at Mara for a long moment, and she had the distinct impression that he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not as a target variable, not as a complication to be managed, but as something else, something he had not accounted for. He said nothing. He turned to his three men and made a brief economical hand gesture. They lowered their weapons. He walked back to the freight elevator without looking at Mara or Calloway again. His men followed him in. The gate closed. The elevator descended. Mara stood in the middle of the factory floor and listened to the cables working until the sound faded. Then she turned around. The progress bar was at 94%. Calloway was already back at the keyboard, both hands moving, running final confirmation checks on the distribution package with the focused intensity of a man who understood that the next 60 seconds were the point toward which everything else had been building. 97, 99. The screen went white for a half second. Then a single line of green text appeared against the dark interface. Transfer complete. Distribution confirmed. 412 addresses. Timestamp 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Calloway sat back in his chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The generator hummed in the corner. Rain moved against the boarded windows. Somewhere below them and far away, a train moved through the city. "It's done," Calloway said. He said it quietly, the way people say things that they have been working toward for a long time and are not yet certain how to hold. Mara set the steel conduit down on the table. Her hand was shaking slightly. She noticed, not from fear, but from the release of something that had been held at extreme tension for 4 days without a moment of genuine relief. She let it shake and did not try to stop it. She sat down on the edge of the table and looked at the green confirmation text on the screen. Samuel had built this for a decade, had sat alone in the mountains in the clean, dry air of that concrete bunker and assembled it piece by piece with his engineer's precision and his old man's patience, and his absolute unwavering certainty that the truth was a structural thing, that it had load-bearing properties, that if you built it right and anchored it correctly, it would hold against whatever was placed on top of it. He had been right. She thought about him driving to Greenwich in October of 2013 with his folder of documentation sitting across from his son, watching Garrison dismiss everything he had brought with the calm certainty of a man who had already been told what to think. She thought about Samuel driving back to Virginia that night, sitting on the cabin porch in the dark, thinking about Claire, and then going inside and continuing to work. That was the thing she could not stop thinking about. Not the gold, not the network, not the 15 years of meticulous documentation. The simple fact of him continuing, of a man in his 70s alone in the mountains with no institutional support and no guarantee that any of it would ever matter, choosing to continue. She reached into her jacket pocket and closed her hand around the iron key. It was there, still there, rust rough against her palm, heavy and precise, the same weight it had been when she picked it up off the floor of her father's study 4 days ago. The world began to move while they were still in the building. Calloway had contacts at 3 news organizations who had standing protocols for receiving sensitive material through his distribution network. And by 5 in the morning, less than 2 hours after the transfer completed, he was on an encrypted call with an editor at a London-based international outlet who had already had 2 analysts working through the Carthage files for 90 minutes and wanted confirmation on 3 specific routing chains before going to press. Calloway gave confirmation. Then a second call, this one to a Washington correspondent he had worked with for a decade. Then a third to the wire service editor, whose organization had relationships with every major newspaper on the continent. By 6:30 in the morning, the first stories were live. By 7, the Associated Press had moved a bulletin. By 8, every major television network in the United States had interrupted its morning programming. Mara sat on the factory floor with her back against the brick wall, and Calloway's field laptop balanced on her knees, watching it happen in real time. The stories were careful at first, the responsible hedging of outlets that understood the liability of being first, but they became less careful very quickly because the documentation was too comprehensive and too precisely sourced to require the usual journalistic caution. Samuel had built the evidence to be self-sustaining. It did not need a journalist to interpret it. It needed only a journalist willing to publish it, and there were 412 of those now in every time zone on the planet. Whitfield Global Logistics, implicated in decade-long arms trafficking network. Senate Armed Services Committee members named in leaked financial documents. Interpol issues. Red notices for multiple subjects following release of Carthage files. Whitfield Logistics CEO Garrison. Whitfield named as signatory. FBI raids Whitfield Global Logistics headquarters in Manhattan. Federal sources confirm multiple arrests expected. She watched the Manhattan headquarters footage on a live news stream. The blue and white FBI field vehicles on the sidewalk outside the building she had visited twice as a child for Bring Your Daughter to Work days that Garrison had organized with the formal precision he applied to all parental obligations. Federal agents in blue jackets moving through the lobby, the building's doormen standing to one side looking stunned. The Whitfield Lighthouse logo above the entrance enormous in polished steel catching the morning light. At 9:47 in the morning, an alert from a local Connecticut news affiliate. She read it twice. Whitfield Global Logistics CEO Garrison. Whitfield taken into custody at Greenwich residence. Federal agents confirm arrest in connection with ongoing investigation. Mara looked at the screen for a long time. She thought about her father in handcuffs on the manicured lawn of the Greenwich estate, the iron gates behind him, the stone lions flanking the entrance. She thought about the expression Calloway had predicted, the genuine confusion of a man who had signed documents for 17 years without understanding what they actually authorized, who had been managed and positioned and kept carefully uninformed by a woman who had understood from the first moment she identified him as a target exactly how to use a grieving man's need to not look too closely at the things that kept his world functioning. Garrison Whitfield was not innocent. He had signed the authorizations. He had dismissed his father's warnings, not once but twice had allowed his legal team to assault Samuel's credibility in court filings, had handed his daughter a rusted key, and sent a demolition crew to a mountain cabin. Whatever Diane had done to him, whatever she had taken from him, he had made choices that a different man might not have made. But he had not built the network. He had not designed the shell structure or recruited the contractors or managed the operational logistics of moving weapons across 3 continents. He had been the surface, the legitimate face, the credible signature, the trusted name on the letterhead. Diane had been the canvas underneath, the invisible structure on which everything else rested. The alert about Diane came at 11:15. Diane Croft Whitfield apprehended at Teterboro Airport, New Jersey. Sources confirm subject was attempting to board private aircraft bound for Antigua. Multiple federal charges expected. Calloway read it from across the room and looked at Mara. Antigua, he said, no extradition treaty with the United States. She had it planned, Mara said. She had the exit plan the same way she had everything else planned. The aircraft was probably on standby from the moment the bunker was breached. But she didn't make it. She didn't make it, Mara agreed. The subsequent reporting filled in the details over the following hours. Diane had been at the Teterboro General Aviation Terminal with 2 pieces of luggage and a carry bag. The luggage contained clothing and personal items and a collection of bearer bonds, untraceable financial instruments, the kind that a person carries when they intend to rebuild a financial identity in a jurisdiction that does not ask questions. The carry bag contained a small electronic device that forensic agents would later identify as the specific detonator frequency used to trigger the explosive charge that had destroyed Samuel's bunker door and subsequently collapsed the northeast quadrant of the cabin structure. She had been identified from security camera footage at the terminal entrance. The footage had been accessed by a federal agent acting on a tip from a network analyst who had been working through the Carthage files since 4 in the morning and had found in a subfolder Samuel had labeled Operational Personnel a photograph of Diane Croft at a private airfield in 2011, standing beside a man who was already on 3 federal watch lists. Samuel had taken that photograph himself. He had driven 4 hours to get it, waited most of a day to capture it, and filed it in the correct folder. He had anticipated even this. The federal warrant against Mara was formally withdrawn at 2:17 in the afternoon via a statement issued by the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, U.S. Attorney's Office, that used the phrase material witness with exculpatory evidence and the phrase ongoing federal investigation and did not include an apology because federal agencies do not typically include apologies in their press releases. A second statement issued 40 minutes later by the FBI's Philadelphia field office referred to Mara as a cooperative witness whose information had been critical to the advancement of the investigation. Calloway read both statements aloud to her and then looked up over his glasses with the expression of a man who found the specific language of institutional self-protection professionally familiar. "It means they're not coming after you," he said. "It means they want you on their side of the table." "I know what it means," Mara said. She was already thinking about the next thing. She spent 2 days in Philadelphia. Calloway connected her with a federal criminal defense attorney named Hargrove, who had handled whistleblower cases for 30 years and who sat across from her in a conference room and told her with the blunt directness of a man who charged by the hour and respected his clients enough not to waste their time, that her position was considerably stronger than the government's current framing of it suggested, and that the Krugerrand coins she was carrying were legally hers as the sole heir of Samuel Whitfield's estate, and that she should not speak to any federal investigator without him present, and that the environmental contamination liability case that could be built against Whitfield Logistics' operational history was substantial, and she should be thinking about it. She was already thinking about it. On the third day, she drove south. She took I-95 to Richmond and then the state routes into the Blue Ridge foothills. The Subaru climbing the familiar grades with its usual unpredictable heater and its 187,000 miles of accumulated history. The October trees had gone fully into their color, the Virginia maples red-orange against the dark green of the pines, the occasional golden column of a tulip poplar standing among the darker canopy. She drove with the window cracked in cold mountain air moving through the car and Samuel's leather journal on the seat beside her. Ridgeback Hollow Road was cordoned at the county road intersection by a single orange barrier and a federal crime scene notice on a laminated card. There was nobody manning it. She moved the barrier, drove through, replaced it behind her, and continued up the driveway. The cabin was gone. Not gradually gone, not partially damaged, structurally gone. The roof collapsed entirely into the foundation, the walls fallen inward, the stone fireplace standing alone at one end of the wreckage like a monument to something that no longer existed. The ivy that had covered the east wall was blackened and dead. The porch was indistinguishable from the general debris. Crime scene tape had been run around the perimeter and tied to steel stakes driven into the ground, and yellow placard markers had been placed at intervals where the forensic team had documented and collected. She parked the Subaru and got out and stood at the edge of the debris field for a long time. The federal investigation had already been through the bunker. She knew this from Hargrove, who had been briefed by the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case. The servers had been seized and were in an FBI digital forensics laboratory in Quantico. The remaining gold had been inventoried and was being held pending the outcome of the estate proceedings, at which point her attorney was confident it would be released to her as the documented heir. The Carthage files themselves, the full 92% of what had transferred to the Kingston drive, plus the additional files recovered from the servers, were now part of what the U.S. Attorney's Office was calling the most comprehensive corporate criminal case file assembled since Enron. Samuel's ledger was in federal evidence storage. His leather journal was on the passenger seat of her car. She walked to the edge of the stone fireplace. It was the only thing standing. The mortar had cracked in several places from the blast and the subsequent collapse of the structure around it, but the stonework itself, the field stone that Samuel had chosen and placed himself, the mantelpiece he had carved through an entire summer, had held. She looked at the carved panorama. The pines, the bear at the tree line, the two ravens on their branch, the wolf on the far right watching. The wolf's eye was empty. The key was in her pocket. She reached up and touched the carved face with her fingertips, the precise, careful marks of her grandfather's folding knife. Each needle and branch rendered with the patience of a man who believed that the quality of your attention to small things was a measure of your character. She stood there for the long time with her hand on the stone. She had been thinking in the days since Philadelphia about what came next. Not in an abstract way, but in the practical, methodical way that Samuel had apparently bequeathed to her, along with the cabin and the gold and the evidence that had brought down an empire. She was 18 years old and she was the sole heir of a significant fortune in physical gold and the central witness in a federal prosecution that would occupy the courts for years. She had a defense attorney and a coming legal battle over the environmental remediation liability of a company that had used the Blue Ridge watershed as part of its operational footprint for 2 decades. She had, in other words, more than enough work to do. But standing here at the ruins of the place where Samuel had spent the last decade of his life, she found herself thinking not about the legal strategy or the remediation case or the federal proceedings. She was thinking about a man in his early 70s driving alone to Virginia after his son had looked him in the face and told him he had lost his mind, parking in front of this cabin in the dark, going inside and beginning to work. Not because he was certain it would matter, not because he had a guarantee that the evidence would ever reach anyone, but because the truth was worth building, even if you were not going to be there to see it used. Because the canvas underneath the surface was worth documenting, even if the painted-over world preferred not to know it was there. She reached into her pocket and took out the iron key. She held it in her palm, the weight of it, the rust rough against her skin, the complex asymmetrical teeth worn smooth in the places where they had made contact with the mechanism they were cut to operate. She thought about the day Garrison had slid the envelope off the mahogany desk and it had fallen to the floor, and she had picked it up with steady hands. She thought about how it had felt when she pressed the tip of this key against the carved wolf's eye and felt it seat with that absolute precise certainty, the sound of the mechanism releasing, the stone moving. She looked out over the 20 acres of Blue Ridge forest that stretched away from the cabin foundation, in all directions the Virginia pines in their deep green, the creek audible somewhere below in the hollow, the sky above the canopy, a clean pale blue washed clear by the rain of the previous days. 20 acres of mountain watershed that her grandfather had chosen specifically because he understood what land like this meant, not in financial terms, but in the older, more durable sense of what it means to have a piece of the natural world that is yours to protect rather than exploit. She had made a decision on the drive down from Philadelphia. She was not going to sell this land. She was not going to build on it or develop it or use the gold to turn it into something other than what it was. She was going to use the legal mechanisms available to her, and there were more of them than she had understood before Hargrove explained the landscape, to place the 20 acres in a permanent conservation easement, to protect the watershed, to ensure that whatever happened to the Whitfield name in the courts and the press and the long institutional reckoning that was coming, this specific piece of Blue Ridge Forest would remain what it had always been. She was also going to build something here. Not the cabin was gone, and she did not mourn it exactly because the cabin had only ever been the surface. What she was going to build was smaller and more deliberate, a field research station, a base of operations for the environmental science work she had been told twice by her father was a pointless degree at a state school. She had a full scholarship waiting. She had 40 pounds of gold coins whose legal status would be resolved within months. She had 20 acres of mountain watershed that were hers completely and irrevocably because an old man had been more patient and more precise and more willing to trust her than anyone else in her family had managed to be. She closed her fingers around the key. "You were right, Grandpa," she said. Her voice was quiet in the mountain air. The pines absorbed it. They saw the fresh paint. They never checked the canvas. She paused. "But we did." The creek ran in the hollow below her. A raven moved through the canopy somewhere to her left, its wings audible in the cold air, its call carrying across the ridge before fading. The stone fireplace stood in the autumn light with its carved panorama intact. The bear, the pines, the wolf watching from the right, patient and exact, and built to last by the hands of a man who had understood that some things are worth building, even when the world around you is determined to pretend they have no value. Mara Whitfield put the key in her jacket pocket where it had lived since a rusted manila envelope had fallen to the floor of a mahogany study 4 days ago. She picked up Samuel's leather journal from the passenger seat of the Subaru and walked to the edge of the foundation and sat down on the cold stone with her back to the standing fireplace in the forest in front of her, in the journal open across her knees. She turned to a blank page near the back. She had brought a pen. She wrote the date at the top, October 15th, 2024, Blue Ridge Mountains, Virginia. And then she began to write. Not a legal document, not a formal record, just the beginning of something in her own handwriting on the blank pages that Samuel had left at the back of his journal, as if he had known she would need them. The first notes toward the environmental impact assessment she was going to file with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. The first outline of the litigation strategy she and Hargrove were going to build against the operational legacy of Whitfield Global Logistics in the watershed counties of the Blue Ridge. The first words of the next thing. Samuel Whitfield had spent 10 years building a key. His granddaughter had used it to open the right door. Now she was going to build something of her own.